Hi everyone, absolute pleasure and honour to be here sharing a room with you all and playing such an important part in this conference today and restart throughout the world. And thank you very much, Benny, and everyone else for having us as your partners in this amazing initiative. So I'm Dan. I co-lead the technology practice at White & Case and the Israel practice as well. We're a global law firm, and pleasure to be here with George Canalos, who is a good friend and client from over the years. So George, we've worked on many deals together in Israel when you were at SoftBank, including Stream Elements, Wiliot, eToro. You've done quite a lot of indirect investments into Israeli funds. You've worked on deals at Arm and on a personal account basis as well. How is doing business in Israel different from other markets in Europe, in the Middle East and Africa?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. It's a great honor and pleasure. So I think, at a headline level, Israel is an easy place to do business for an investor. I think it's got a very developed tech ecosystem. The documentation, the processes are very clear. But I think, equally, while the world is more open across everything, it's not necessarily, converging to being exactly the same. And I think for me, there were a few things that, I noticed when I did business in Israel. So one thing was the companies, generally speaking, in the high growth space are a lot less hierarchical. So I think if you contrast that to some of the deals that we've done, say, in India, where you might, deal with, only a founder and a CFO, if you can find a way to hang out in an Israeli office like a bad smell while you're doing diligence, you will find a lot more out than you will in other places, because I think the teams are a lot flatter and people are a lot more open in how they view the progress of the company and what's going on. So that's the first thing. So it's an easy, open place to do diligence. I think the second element was the founding community is very high energy, deals are fast, and people are very direct. And the reason that matters is because, as you know, in what we do, the financings are usually wide open and rushing in or slammed shut. And in the slammed shut phase, it's not an easy place to sort of, slow play decision making. People are very direct and they appreciate you being very direct. And so I think that's a second thing. And then the third thing that I noticed, although I don't know how accurate this remains, is, one of the challenges, I think, of doing high growth deals in Israel is you get a lot of success because, it is a sector, it is a space that has a lot of exits, but people tend to exit early. There was always a tendency more towards M&A, I think particularly because you had more in med tech and cybersecurity in areas where you have a lot of big acquirers going in and doing deals. Now, I don't want to cite this as a specifically Israeli attribute because, the last couple of years have been terrible for tech IPOs. So what I don't know is whether that's changed and, it's masked by the general state of the market, or whether we'll see, the same kind of trend longer term. I think those are the big differences I've noticed.
Thanks. So lots of people have asked me last night and today, how are we seeing deals in Israel? How are investors perceiving the market? What's happened over the last year? Where do you expect things to change in the coming year? And when I look back over this year, we've actually had an incredible year. And speaking to some lawyers in the room as well, it's probably been one of the most successful years for a lot of the big Israeli law firms as well. And people are, sometimes embarrassed by that fact. But actually, I'm incredibly proud and kind of encourage everyone to be incredibly proud about what's been achieved in the market. And that's our way of fighting, by doubling down. Looking back this year, the beginning of the year, we worked on the State of Israel's largest ever bond offering, $8 billion into the US. It was incredibly oversubscribed. Couldn't have been a prouder moment in my career. We've worked on the sale of the controlling interest in the Phoenix by Gallatin and Centerbridge. It was a record-breaking deal for them, just demonstrating the robustness of the Israeli stock market and the insurance sector. One of the acquirers of that business and the controlling stake was Affinity, which is Jared Kushner's fund, backed by Saudi investors. Despite everything that we're seeing this year, those type of deals are still happening. We've worked on first-time buyer acquisitions, including Belfuse, which is a very large US-listed business buying Enercorn Technologies in Israel. Plenty of late-stage funding rounds, plenty of M&A, as you're describing, kind of preempting the IPO markets when things just aren't there. It feels like we're still in a bubble despite everything that's going on. But obviously, a lot of that is coming from the US, where people who previously invested in Israel are doubling down their efforts and trying to do even more deals in Israel. A lot of that is up from friends and family from outside of the US who want to support the economy. I think it's fair to say that European investments have slowed down, and that's particularly true of institutions. But despite the issues in the Middle East, some of the Middle East investors are still working in the background and waiting for the markets to open up and the opportunities to develop, which I think we'll talk about in a moment. But from your experience, how have things changed since October the 7th?
Yeah, so I think at a headline level, I agree with you, Daniel. It's very, very resilient. I think, speaking about tech specifically, you are seeing still a lot of big funding rounds. And what I would say is, I think you talked about the European market. The European tech market, I think, is also dealing with a lot of fallout at home, and you're seeing, some of the big name funds struggle a little bit. So that's also played in. But I think focusing specifically on Israel, I think, look, the tragedy of October 7th, the war afterwards, all these things are, they're incredibly serious challenges for a society. So to say that, to say that, it's had zero impact, I think is probably, disingenuous. But I think when you look at the situation, it's very important to separate the short term from the long term. So I think, in the short term, obviously, it's disruptive. You worry about, friends, colleagues. You can't necessarily travel to everywhere. You've seen, companies maybe having to move bases internally, things like that. And you also have, a lot of the, because ultimately, businesses are people. You have a lot of these, very difficult to quantify personal circumstances that impact, personal tragedies, people being diverted, serving in the armed forces, that impact, this stuff. But I think if you take a step back from the kind of geopolitical worry and you look at the long term and the prospects of Israeli tech, I think, first of all, there's an incredible technology infrastructure in Israel, right? So, I think that the previous speech, discussed some of this. You've got, it's basically 20% of the economy now. You have not just a lot of founders and companies, but all of the infrastructure around it, lawyers, funds, all of the things you need to succeed. And it's very hard to see that sort of, disappearing or materially changing over a short period. I think that's the first point. I think the second point is in growth technology in particular, with the exception of very few sectors, you have to crack the United States if you want to grow. And Israeli companies and Israeli founders tend to be very comfortable going abroad. They tend to have good relationships with the US, understand it. That's also a big plus. And the third thing is, and this is going to sound a little bit wishy-washy to everyone, but I think Israeli tech has now entered that kind of rarefied club where risk-taking has created a cultural flywheel. I'm not a political economist or a sociologist. We can debate all the drivers in different places that cause this, but you see, in the IITs in India and Silicon Valley, in Tel Aviv, you have certain areas where risk-taking is just a lot higher. And I think, you can contrast that, and forgive me, any Polish colleagues in the audience don't know a business, it's a wonderful place. But you see, for example, in Poland, you have some of the, strongest, academic AI researchers massively overrepresented in, institutions and very large companies, but you're not getting the same throughput of startups. And that's sort of a, ineffable thing that you can't really quantify. So I think all of these things make me bullish on the longer term on Israeli tech. And I think the other thing that I would say is when you look at the change, you have to parse the data not just for crisis, but also for trends, right? So I think, if you have a company that's raising, in a dual-use technology, they may have, hesitant investors at the moment. But actually, if you have VC funds that are struggling to raise, well, you've got over-allocation of capital. You've had this problem across, the United States as well. So you've got to kind of parse out which part relates to what.
Yeah, that resonates a lot. What sectors especially excite you at the moment in Israel?
So I think one of the great things about Israel, actually, and I mean, I've looked at over the years, everything from, fisheries, agri-tech, the defense technologies, all sorts of things, is that what you often see in tech is, with the exception maybe of Silicon Valley, is you see clusters. You'll get semiconductors in Taiwan, you'll get med tech in Kobe. Like, in Israel, you actually have a very good balance within the tech sector. So, everyone's got a neobank and an online grocery store. But in Israel, you've got hardware, you have semis talent, you have software businesses. So there's a lot for everyone. For me personally, the most exciting space right now is cybersecurity. And I know that people who work in Israeli tech are going to be like, thanks for the big news. But I think that, what you see happening now with AI and the wave of, agents, chat bots, virtual assistants, all this stuff that's coming through is creating a lot of challenges in this space. And so having that dominance, even versus the United States now, in Israel, in cybersecurity, I think they're going to have a really, really big, even more of a boom than you've had in this space.
Yeah, and just quickly talking about the Middle East, you've obviously had a lot of experience with investors and LPs, both in the UAE and in Saudi. How do you see a Saudi normalization / peace deal and the Trump administration affecting business vis-a-vis Israel in the region?
Yeah, so I think, look, at a headline level, easier relationships are always better for business. I think, there's two elements to it, right? One people get very excited about is the Saudi investment potential, and that's absolutely there, and I think, is very valuable. I will say at a personal level, what I've found is the last couple of years, I think most of the Middle Eastern sovereigns are becoming more sort of aware of their own heft. And so they're much more focused on opportunities that move the dial domestically, and keeping their attentions becoming harder. And so I think that will be a big element. But for Israel in particular, I'm almost more excited about the other direction, which is, when you think about Saudi Arabia versus the UAE, it's a country that's 4 or 5 times the size of the population, very many young, a government that's sort of, dying to level up almost anything it can. And so if you find ways for your mature, companies to service that kind of macro demographic wave there and development wave, I think that could be incredibly valuable, just given, how physically proximate Israel is.
Thanks a lot. And just to wrap up, what's the best advice you can give a first-time investor in Israel?
Okay. There's going to be no magic to it. I think, one thing is, like where I'm from in Greece, it's a small place. So I think in smaller places, being on the ground as much as you can is very valuable. People know each other, you build a reputation. That's the first thing. Get a good advisor like yourself who knows the region, knows how things work, and can make introductions as well. And I think in the negotiations, try to give as hard as you get.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Thanks, everyone.